Welcome, history enthusiast. In our imagination, the Renaissance feels like a golden age, a radiant chapter in human history where creativity flourished, knowledge awakened, and humanity seemed to rise from the shadows into light. It is often painted as a time of brilliance, where art reached breathtaking heights, where thinkers questioned the boundaries of existence, and where a new sense of individuality began to take root. When we hear the word Renaissance, we picture magnificent paintings, grand architecture, and minds that seemed almost superhuman in their ability to imagine and create. It feels like a moment when the world paused its suffering and stepped into something beautiful, something elevated, something almost perfect. But this image, as powerful and captivating as it is, hides a much darker and more uncomfortable truth. Because while history celebrates the Renaissance as a rebirth of culture and intellect, for the overwhelming majority of people living through it, there was no sense of rebirth at all. There was no golden glow, no feeling of transformation, no escape from hardship. Instead, life remained harsh, uncertain, and deeply unequal. The idea of the Renaissance as a golden age is, in many ways, a story told from the perspective of the few, not the many. It reflects the experiences of artists, scholars, and wealthy patrons, not the everyday reality of the ordinary person. For those at the bottom of society, life did not suddenly improve because art was flourishing or because new ideas were being discussed in elite circles. Their world did not change in ways that made survival easier. Their struggles did not disappear in the presence of beauty. If anything, the contrast between the lives of the privileged and the lives of the poor became even more striking during this time. It is important to understand that history often remembers what is most visible, most extraordinary, and most impressive. It remembers the masterpieces, the innovations, the breakthroughs. It remembers the people who left behind something remarkable. But what it often forgets are the millions of lives that were lived quietly, without recognition, without legacy, and without relief from suffering. The Renaissance is remembered through its achievements, but it was lived through its hardships. When we look at paintings from this era, we see elegance, harmony, and beauty. We see carefully composed scenes that reflect balance and perfection. But these images do not tell us about the conditions in which most people lived. They do not show the dirt, the hunger, the exhaustion, or the fear that define daily life for so many. They do not reveal the reality behind the illusion. And this illusion is powerful because it shapes how we understand the past. It creates the impression that progress, once it begins, benefits everyone equally. It suggests that when a society advances culturally or intellectually, the lives of all its people improve alongside it. But history does not work that way. Progress is often uneven. It lifts some while leaving others behind. It creates opportunities for a few while maintaining struggles for many. The Renaissance was no exception. It was a time of incredible achievement, but it was also a time of deep inequality. The wealth that funded great works of art did not come from a system that benefited everyone. It came from structures of power that concentrated resources in the hands of a small elite. While patrons invested in artists and thinkers, the majority of the population continued to work tirelessly just to survive. Their labor supported the very system that allowed the Renaissance to flourish, yet they rarely shared in its rewards. This is the paradox at the heart of the Renaissance. It was both a period of enlightenment and a period of suffering, a time of beauty and a time of hardship, a moment of progress that did not reach everyone equally. To truly understand it, we have to look beyond the surface, beyond the art and the ideas, and into the lived experiences of ordinary people. We have to question the narrative that presents it as a universally positive transformation. Because for most people, life during this time did not feel like a step forward. It did not feel like a rebirth. It felt like a continuation of struggle, shaped by forces they could not control. Imagine living in a world where your future is determined not by your talent or ambition, but by the circumstances of your birth. Where opportunities are limited, and where survival depends on factors that are completely outside your control. This was the reality for the majority during the Renaissance. Social mobility was extremely limited. If you were born into poverty, you were likely to remain in poverty for your entire life. The idea of rising through the ranks, of changing your destiny through effort or skill, was not something most people could realistically hope for. The systems in place were designed to maintain the existing order, not to challenge it. And while intellectuals may have been exploring new ideas about human potential and individuality, these ideas rarely translated into meaningful change for those at the bottom of society. There is also a tendency to view the Renaissance as a clean break from the past, as if it marked a clear transition from a dark period into a bright one. But in reality, history is not divided so neatly. The changes that occurred during the Renaissance were gradual, complex, and often contradictory. Old systems of power remained in place even as new ideas began to emerge. Traditional hierarchies continued to shape society even as some thinkers began to question them. For the average person, daily life did not suddenly transform because a new artistic style had developed or because scholars were rediscovering ancient texts. Their concerns remained immediate and practical: finding enough food, avoiding illness, surviving the winter, and navigating a world that offered very little security. It is also important to recognize that the Renaissance was not experienced in the same way everywhere. While certain cities became centers of art and learning, many rural areas saw little change. The benefits of cultural and intellectual growth were often concentrated in specific regions, leaving others largely untouched. Even within cities, the divide between rich and poor was stark. Grand buildings and public displays of wealth stood in contrast to overcrowded and unsanitary living conditions for the majority. This contrast is crucial to understanding why the idea of the Renaissance as a universally positive era is misleading. It was a time of extremes where brilliance and suffering existed side by side. And while it is natural to be drawn to the brilliance, we should not ignore the suffering that made it possible. The story of the Renaissance is not just a story of great achievements. It is also a story of inequality, of hardship, and of the countless lives that were shaped by forces beyond their control. When we strip away the romanticized image of this period, we begin to see it more clearly, not as a perfect golden age, but as a complex and often harsh reality. And this perspective does not diminish the importance of the Renaissance. Instead, it gives us a more honest understanding of it. It reminds us that progress is not always shared equally, and that the experiences of ordinary people are just as important as the achievements of the extraordinary. It challenges us to look beyond the surface and to question the narratives we are given. Because history is not just about what was created or discovered. It is also about how people lived, how they struggled, and how they endured. And when we begin to see the Renaissance through this lens, the illusion of a golden age starts to fade, revealing a much more complicated and human story, one that is not defined by perfection, but by contrast, not by universal progress, but by uneven change, not by a shared sense of rebirth, but by a reality that, for most people, still felt like a fight to survive. Picture this. You wake up before the sun has even begun to rise, not to the sound of an alarm clock, but to the quiet, gnawing ache in your stomach that never really goes away. The air is cold, damp, and heavy, seeping through the cracks of the small, fragile structure you call home. There is no comfort here, no softness, no sense of security. The place you live in is not designed for rest or peace, but for mere survival. The floor beneath you is hard, often just packed earth, and the walls are thin, barely keeping out the wind or the rain. If you are fortunate, you share this space with your family, though sharing often means crowding together in a way that leaves little room to breathe, little room to exist as an individual. Privacy is not something you understand, because it has never been a part of your life. Everything you do, every moment you live, happens in the presence of others, because there is no space for anything else. You rise not because you want to, but because you must. The day ahead is not filled with possibilities or choices. It is already decided for you. It has been decided since the day you were born. You are not an artist, not a thinker, not a noble with influence or wealth. You are a peasant, and that identity defines every aspect of your existence. Your hands tell your story before you ever speak. They are rough, hardened by years of labor, marked by cuts and scars that never fully heal. Your body carries the weight of a life spent working, bending, lifting, enduring. There is no concept of taking a day off, no idea that rest is something you deserve. Work is not a part of your life, it is your life. From the moment you are old enough to contribute, you are expected to do so because survival depends on it. As you step outside, the world around you does not greet you with beauty or inspiration. It greets you with necessity. The land you work is not yours, even though your entire existence depends on it. It belongs to someone more powerful, someone whose face you may rarely see, but whose authority shapes every decision you make. You till the soil, plant the seeds, tend the crops, all with the knowledge that much of what you produce will not be yours to keep. You work to feed others as much as you work to feed yourself, and often you come last in that equation. The uncertainty of it all hangs over you constantly. The success of your labor depends on things you cannot control. The weather can turn against you without warning. A season of drought can destroy months of effort. Too much rain can be just as devastating as too little. Pests can invade, diseases can spread through crops, and there is nothing you can do but watch and hope that enough survives to get you through another year. Hope in your world is not a feeling of optimism. It is a fragile thread you cling to because without it, there is nothing left. Food is never guaranteed. Hunger is a familiar presence, not an occasional discomfort but a constant companion. There are days when meals are small and days when they are even smaller. You learn to stretch what little you have, to make it last as long as possible, knowing that the next harvest is uncertain. The idea of abundance is almost unimaginable. You do not eat for pleasure or enjoyment. You eat to survive, and sometimes even that is not enough. Your body adapts to this reality, but it never fully accepts it. The weakness, the fatigue, the lack of energy become part of who you are. And yet you keep going because stopping is not an option. The people around you live the same way. There is a shared understanding of struggle, a collective experience of hardship that binds you together, but it does not make things easier. Everyone is carrying their own burdens, facing their own fears. There is little room for sympathy when survival demands all of your focus. Community exists, but it is shaped by necessity rather than comfort. You rely on others when you must, and they rely on you, but everyone knows that there is only so much anyone can give. Illness is another shadow that follows you through life. There is no safety net, no reliable way to protect yourself from disease. If you fall sick, your ability to work disappears, and with it, your ability to survive. There are no guarantees of care, no effective treatments, no understanding of what is happening inside your body. Sickness is mysterious, unpredictable, and often deadly. You may recover, or you may not. And if you do not, life around you continues, because it has to. Death is not an unusual event. It is a regular part of existence, something you witness and experience in ways that shape your understanding of the world from a very young age. Children grow up quickly because they have no choice. There is no extended period of innocence, no protected time to explore or play without responsibility. From an early age, they are expected to contribute, to learn the skills they will need to survive, to become part of the cycle that defines life in this world. They see the struggles of their parents, the exhaustion, the worry, and they understand that this will be their future as well. Dreams, in the sense of imagining a different life, are not something that most people allow themselves to entertain. The gap between what is and what could be feels too large, too impossible to cross. Your place in society is fixed, reinforced by traditions and systems that leave little room for change. You do not question it, not because you are incapable of thinking differently, but because questioning it offers no practical benefit. It does not change your circumstances. It does not make your life easier. Instead, it can create danger, drawing attention from those who hold power and expect obedience. So you accept what is, not out of contentment, but out of necessity. Every day follows a similar pattern, a rhythm defined by labor and survival. There is a certain predictability to it, but it is not comforting. It is a reminder that tomorrow will be much like today, and the day after that, and the day after that. Change, when it comes, is often unwelcome. It comes in the form of bad harvests, harsh winters, illness, or demands from those in power. Stability is fragile, easily disrupted, and difficult to regain once lost. Despite all of this, there are moments, however small, that remind you of your humanity. A shared laugh, a brief rest, a sense of connection with those around you. These moments do not erase the hardship, but they offer a glimpse of something more, something that makes the struggle bearable, if only for a little while. They are not enough to transform your life, but they are enough to keep you moving forward. Because in this world, moving forward is the only option. There is no alternative path, no hidden opportunity waiting to be discovered. There is only the life you have been given, shaped by forces beyond your control, sustained by your effort, and defined by your ability to endure. This is what it meant to be an ordinary person during the Renaissance. Not a participant in a grand cultural awakening, but a survivor in a world that demanded everything you had and gave very little in return. And while history remembers the extraordinary achievements of this era, it is this reality, lived by millions, that truly defines what life was like for most people. While history often invites us to admire the extraordinary achievements of this era, to stand in awe of the genius of Leonardo da Vinci and the breathtaking creations of Michelangelo, it rarely asks us to confront the environment in which the majority of people actually lived, an environment that was far removed from the beauty captured in paintings and sculptures, a world defined not by harmony and perfection but by filth, disease, and a constant, inescapable proximity to death, where daily life unfolded in conditions that would feel unbearable by modern standards, and yet were completely normal at the time, accepted not because they were comfortable, but because there was no alternative, no vision of something better that could realistically be achieved by those trapped within it. And so as the masterpieces of the Renaissance took shape in studios, most people continued to exist in surroundings that were crowded, unsanitary, and deeply hazardous to their health. Living in homes that were often little more than single-room structures made of rough materials, where entire families slept, ate, and worked in the same confined space, sometimes alongside animals whose presence added to the already overwhelming mix of smells, waste, and contamination, creating an environment where cleanliness was nearly impossible to maintain, and where the concept of hygiene as we understand it today simply did not exist, not because people preferred filth, but because the knowledge and resources required to create clean living conditions were either unavailable or inaccessible to them, and as a result, the spaces in which they lived became breeding grounds for disease, with dirt floors that absorbed waste and moisture, walls that trapped dampness, and air that carried the lingering scent of decay, all of which contributed to a constant state of physical discomfort and vulnerability. And stepping outside did not offer relief but often made things worse, because the streets of towns and cities were no cleaner than the homes themselves, frequently serving as open channels for waste disposal where garbage, animal remains, and human excrement were thrown without much thought, accumulating over time and creating a landscape that was both visually and physically toxic, especially in areas where population density was high and infrastructure for waste management was virtually non-existent, turning urban centers into places where the risk of illness was ever present and where simply going about your daily routine meant exposing yourself to countless unseen dangers, and water, something that is so fundamental to life, was not always safe to drink, often drawn from sources that were easily contaminated by the very waste that filled the streets, making it a potential vehicle for disease rather than a means of sustenance. And yet people had little choice but to use it, because alternatives were limited or non-existent, and this lack of clean water further compounded the health risks that defined everyday life, making it incredibly difficult to maintain even the most basic level of personal cleanliness, which in turn allowed infections and illnesses to spread more easily from person to person, creating a cycle that was difficult to break and nearly impossible to control. And within this environment, disease was not an occasional threat, but a constant presence, something that could strike at any moment without warning, affecting individuals, families, and entire communities with devastating speed, and the memory of the Black Death still lingered heavily over society, not as a distant historical event, but as a relatively recent catastrophe that had reshaped populations and left deep psychological scars, reminding people of how quickly life could be taken away and how powerless they were in the face of such forces. And even though that particular wave of devastation had passed, the conditions that allowed it to spread had not disappeared, meaning that outbreaks of plague and other diseases continued to occur, sometimes in smaller waves, sometimes with renewed intensity, keeping fear alive and reinforcing the sense that safety was always temporary and fragile. And beyond the plague, there were countless other illnesses that people faced without any real understanding of their causes or cures, diseases like smallpox, tuberculosis, and various infections that could arise from even minor injuries, all of which had the potential to become fatal in a world where medical knowledge was limited and often based on theories that did not accurately reflect how the human body worked, and treatments, when they were available, were frequently ineffective or even harmful, relying on practices that could weaken the body further rather than heal it, leaving people to depend largely on luck, resilience, and faith when it came to surviving illness. And this lack of effective medical care meant that something as simple as a fever or a cut could escalate into a life-threatening condition, creating a constant undercurrent of anxiety that shaped how people lived and how they viewed their own mortality, because death was not something that happened only in old age or under extraordinary circumstances. It was something that could occur at any stage of life, often suddenly and without clear explanation, making it an ever-present reality rather than a distant possibility, and this reality influenced not only individual experiences but also the structure of families and communities, where loss was common and grieving was a regular part of life, integrated into the social fabric in a way that reflected both the frequency and the inevitability of death. And yet, even in the face of such overwhelming challenges, people continued to live, to work, and to adapt as best they could, developing routines and coping mechanisms that allowed them to navigate a world that offered very little security, relying on shared knowledge, traditional remedies, and collective support to manage the risks they faced, even though these efforts could not eliminate those risks entirely. And in this context, the contrast between the celebrated achievements of the Renaissance and the lived reality of most people becomes even more striking, because while art and intellectual pursuits reached new heights, the basic conditions of life for the majority remained harsh and unforgiving, highlighting a divide that is essential to understanding this period not as a uniform experience of progress and enlightenment, but as a complex and often contradictory era in which beauty and suffering existed side by side, each shaping the other in ways that are not always immediately visible when we look back at history through the lens of its greatest accomplishments. And recognizing this complexity allows us to move beyond the simplified narrative of a golden age, and to see the Renaissance for what it truly was, a time of remarkable human achievement that unfolded within a world that was still deeply marked by hardship, vulnerability, and the constant threat of disease and death, a world where the brilliance of a few stood in stark contrast to the daily struggles of many, and where the reality of life for most people was defined not by the pursuit of greatness, but by the ongoing effort to survive in conditions that were as dangerous as they were unavoidable. Now think about what it meant to work during this time, not as a choice or a path to fulfillment, but as an unavoidable condition of existence, something that defined every waking moment of your life and left little room for anything else. Because in a world without modern labor laws, without protections, without even the idea that a person might deserve rest or balance, work was relentless, constant, and deeply exhausting, stretching from the first light of dawn until darkness made it impossible to continue, and even then the body did not truly recover because the cycle would begin again the next day with the same demands, the same pressures, and the same unspoken understanding that survival depended entirely on your ability to keep going no matter how tired you felt, no matter how much your muscles ached or your hands trembled from overuse. And this was not limited to a specific group of people, but was the reality for the vast majority. Whether you were a farmer working land, a craftsman shaping materials into tools or goods, or a servant fulfilling the needs of those above you, your time was not your own, your energy was not yours to conserve, and your life was structured around the expectation that you would produce, contribute, and endure without complaint, because there was no alternative system to support you if you could not. And for farmers in particular, the burden was especially heavy because their work was tied directly to the land and to the unpredictable forces of nature, requiring not only physical strength but also constant attention and effort throughout the year. From preparing the soil to planting seeds, from tending to growing crops to harvesting what little might be produced, and each stage carried its own risks and uncertainties, because no matter how hard you worked, no matter how carefully you followed the rhythms of the seasons, the outcome was never guaranteed. A sudden drought could dry the fields and destroy months of labor, excessive rain could flood crops and rot them before they were ready, pests could invade and consume what you had hoped to harvest, and diseases could spread through plants just as they did through people, leaving behind fields that could no longer sustain those who depended on them. And in such a fragile system where success depended on factors beyond human control, failure was always a possibility, not a rare event but a recurring threat that shaped how people thought about their work and their future. Because when crops failed, the consequences were immediate and severe, leading to shortages that affected entire communities and creating conditions where hunger became unavoidable. And hunger during this time was not simply a matter of discomfort or inconvenience, but a serious and often life-threatening condition, something that weakened the body, reduced the ability to work, and made people more vulnerable to illness, creating a cycle in which those who needed to work the most were often the least able to do so. And as food became scarce, the social fabric of communities could begin to strain under the pressure, with families forced to make difficult decisions about how to distribute what little they had, sometimes prioritizing those who could contribute the most to survival while others were left with less. and this harsh reality meant that even in times when there was enough to get by, there was rarely a sense of security, because people knew how quickly circumstances could change, how easily a single bad season could push them to the edge of starvation, and this constant uncertainty made it impossible to relax or to feel truly safe, even during periods of relative stability. And beyond agriculture, those who worked in trades or crafts faced their own set of challenges, often spending long hours in workshops that were poorly lit and inadequately ventilated, performing repetitive tasks that required precision and endurance but offered little in the way of comfort or reward. And while skilled artisans might have had slightly more stability than laborers, they were still bound by systems that limited their independence and controlled their output, often working under guild structures or for patrons who dictated the terms of their labor, leaving them with little freedom to set their own pace or conditions. And for servants, the situation could be even more restrictive, as their work was directly tied to the needs and demands of those they served, requiring them to be constantly available, attentive, and obedient, often performing physically demanding tasks for long hours with minimal recognition or compensation. And in all of these roles, the idea of a break or a day of rest as something guaranteed simply did not exist, because while there were occasional religious observances that might reduce the workload temporarily, these moments were exceptions rather than the rule, and they did not fundamentally change the overall pattern of relentless labor that defined daily life. And this lack of rest had a profound impact on the body and mind, leading to chronic exhaustion that people learned to live with because they had no choice, pushing themselves beyond their limits not out of ambition but out of necessity, because falling behind in work could have immediate consequences for survival, whether that meant losing a harvest, failing to meet obligations, or being unable to provide for oneself or one's family. And this pressure created a way of life in which endurance was valued above all else, where the ability to keep going despite pain and fatigue was not seen as extraordinary but as expected, and where weakness, whether due to illness or injury, could quickly become a serious problem because there were few systems in place to support those who could not work, leaving them vulnerable to poverty, neglect, or worse. And as a result, people often continued to work even when they were unwell, risking further harm to themselves because the alternative was simply not viable. And this relentless cycle of labor and survival left little room for personal growth or exploration, because time and energy were consumed by the immediate demands of life, making it difficult to pursue education, creativity, or any activity that did not directly contribute to survival. And while the Renaissance is often celebrated as a time of intellectual awakening and artistic flourishing, these developments were largely confined to those who had the resources and freedom to engage with them, while the majority remained focused on the basic task of staying alive. And this divide highlights the uneven nature of progress during this period, where advancements in one area did not necessarily translate into improvements in everyday life for everyone. And in fact, the systems that supported these advancements often depended on the labor of those who saw little benefit from them, creating a situation in which the achievements of the few were built on the efforts of the many. And yet, despite all of this, people continued to persevere, to find ways to adapt to their circumstances, to support one another when possible, and to endure the challenges they faced, not because they believed their situation would change, but because survival required it. And in this sense, the story of work during the Renaissance is not just a story of hardship, but also a testament to human resilience, to the ability of individuals and communities to continue functioning under conditions that were physically and emotionally demanding, even when the rewards for their efforts were limited and uncertain. And understanding this aspect of life during the Renaissance allows us to see beyond the surface of its cultural achievements and to recognize the reality that for most people this was not a time of ease or opportunity, but a time of constant effort, where every day was shaped by the need to work, to produce, and to survive in a world that offered no guarantees and very little relief from the demands it placed on those who lived within it. To understand what life truly felt like during this time, you have to look at the structure of power that shaped every aspect of existence, because society was not built on equality or opportunity, but on rigid hierarchies that placed individuals into fixed positions from which it was incredibly difficult, and often impossible, to escape, creating a world where a small group of people controlled wealth, land, and authority, while the vast majority lived under their influence with little say over their own lives. And this imbalance was not hidden or subtle, but openly accepted as the natural order of things. reinforced by tradition, law, and belief systems that taught people to accept their place rather than challenge it. So from the moment you were born, your position in society was largely determined, not by your abilities or ambitions, but by your family, your status, and the circumstances into which you entered the world, meaning that if you were born into privilege, you would likely remain privileged, surrounded by comfort, opportunity, and protection. But if you were born into poverty, you would inherit not only the struggles of your parents, but also the limitations that came with them. And this lack of mobility created a sense of permanence in social divisions that shaped how people viewed themselves and others, because the distance between classes was not just economic but deeply social and cultural, affecting how people dressed, how they spoke, what they ate, and even how they were treated under the law. And at the top of this structure were nobles and rulers who held significant power over land and resources, often living in conditions of relative luxury compared to the rest of the population, enjoying access to better food, safer living environments, and opportunities for education that allowed them to participate in the intellectual and cultural movements that defined the era, while those below them worked to sustain the system that supported this lifestyle, creating a dynamic in which the labor of many enabled the comfort of a few. And this concentration of power meant that decisions affecting entire communities could be made by individuals who were far removed from the daily realities of those they governed, leading to policies and demands that prioritized maintaining authority and wealth over improving the lives of the general population. And alongside this political and economic power was the immense influence of the Roman Catholic Church, which played a central role in shaping not only religious life but also social norms, moral expectations, and even aspects of governance, creating a system in which spiritual authority was closely intertwined with worldly power. And for many people, the Church was both a source of guidance and a force of control, providing a framework for understanding the world and their place within it, while also reinforcing the idea that the existing social order was part of a divine plan that should not be questioned, meaning that obedience was not just a practical necessity but a moral obligation. And this made it even more difficult for individuals to challenge the conditions in which they lived, because doing so could be seen not only as a social or political act, but as a spiritual transgression with serious consequences. And in such an environment, questioning authority carried significant risks, as those who spoke out or acted against established systems could face punishment ranging from social exclusion to imprisonment or worse, creating a climate in which fear acted as a powerful tool for maintaining control, discouraging dissent and encouraging conformity. And this lack of freedom was not limited to political expression but extended into many areas of daily life, where rules and expectations governed behavior in ways that left little room for personal choice, particularly for those at the lower levels of society who had fewer resources and less protection against the consequences of stepping outside accepted norms. And within this already restrictive system, the experience of women was even more constrained, as they faced additional limitations based on gender that further reduced their autonomy and opportunities, because society at the time was structured in a way that placed men in positions of authority both in public and private life, while women were expected to fulfill roles that were largely defined by family and domestic responsibilities. And from a young age, girls were taught to prepare for a future in which their primary purpose would be to marry, manage a household, and support their husbands, with little emphasis on education or personal development beyond what was necessary to perform these roles. And while there were exceptions, particularly among the elite where some women had access to learning or influence, these cases were not representative of the broader population, where most women had very limited control over their own lives, often moving from the authority of their fathers to that of their husbands with little opportunity to make independent decisions about their future. And marriage itself was often less about personal choice and more about practical considerations such as economic stability, social alliances, or family obligations, meaning that relationships were shaped by necessity rather than individual desire. And once married, women were expected to fulfill their duties without question, managing households, raising children, and contributing to the economic activities of the family where necessary, all while operating within a framework that offered them few legal rights and limited recognition for their contributions. And this imbalance extended into areas such as property ownership and legal standing, where women often had fewer protections and less authority than men, making them more vulnerable to exploitation or hardship if their circumstances changed, for example in cases of widowhood or abandonment, and beyond the household the opportunities available to women were similarly restricted, with most forms of work or public participation either closed to them or heavily regulated, reinforcing the idea that their place was within the domestic sphere rather than in broader society, and this created a situation in which half the population was largely excluded from cultural and intellectual developments that are often associated with the Renaissance, highlighting once again how uneven the benefits of this period were distributed, and even among men the experience of inequality was significant, because while some had access to education, resources, and the ability to influence their environment, many others lived under conditions that limited their ability to change their circumstances, bound by obligations to those above them, and constrained by systems that prioritized stability over mobility. And this meant that for most people life was not about pursuing personal ambitions or exploring new ideas, but about fulfilling roles that had been defined for them by the structure of society, roles that were often demanding, restrictive, and difficult to escape, and yet despite these limitations people found ways to navigate their world, to build relationships, to create meaning within the boundaries they were given, even if those boundaries were narrow and often imposed without their consent, and understanding this aspect of life during the Renaissance is essential to moving beyond the simplified image of a time defined solely by progress and achievement, because it reveals the underlying reality that for the majority of people this was a period shaped by control, inequality, and limited freedom, where the structures of power influenced every aspect of existence and where the possibility of change, while not entirely absent, was far more constrained than the idea of a golden age might suggest, reminding us that history is not only about what was created or discovered, but also about how people lived within the systems that made those achievements possible, and how those systems affected different groups in profoundly different ways, creating a world in which opportunity and hardship were distributed unevenly, and where for many the experience of daily life was defined not by the promise of transformation, but by the reality of constraint and control. Even the earliest stages of life were shaped by uncertainty and risk, because childhood during this time was not protected or extended in the way we often imagine today, but instead was brief, fragile, and deeply intertwined with the harsh realities of the world, where survival itself was never guaranteed, and where many children did not live long enough to reach adulthood, making the experience of growing up fundamentally different from what we consider normal, as families faced the constant possibility of loss and learned to navigate a reality in which joy and grief often existed side by side, shaping how parents and communities approached the raising of children, not with an expectation of long, carefree years, but with an understanding that life could be cut short at any moment. And this awareness influenced everything from the way children were cared for to the roles they were expected to take on as they grew, because from a very young age, those who survived were gradually introduced to responsibilities that reflected the needs of their families and communities, learning practical skills not as a form of personal development, but as a necessity for contributing to the collective effort required to sustain life. And this meant that the boundary between childhood and adulthood was far less defined, with young people often taking on tasks and duties that would be considered far beyond their years in a modern context, working alongside adults in fields, workshops, or households, not because it was ideal but because it was essential, and this early exposure to labor and responsibility shaped their understanding of the world, teaching them quickly that survival depended on effort, cooperation, and endurance, rather than on exploration or play, and while moments of lightness and connection certainly existed, they were woven into a broader reality that demanded maturity at an early age, leaving little room for the kind of prolonged innocence that is often associated with childhood today. And beyond the challenges of growing up, the broader experience of life during this time was defined by a constant awareness of mortality, because death was not distant or abstract but immediate and visible, something that people encountered regularly in their families, their neighborhoods, and their daily lives, whether through illness, accidents, or the cumulative effects of hardship. And this frequent exposure to loss influenced how individuals and communities understood life itself, fostering a perspective in which existence was often seen as uncertain and temporary, something to be endured rather than taken for granted. And in such a context, the achievements and advancements of the Renaissance, while significant, did not necessarily translate into a sense of security or comfort for most people, because the fundamental conditions that shaped their lives remained largely unchanged. And yet it would be incomplete to view this period only through the lens of suffering, because even within these constraints there were elements of resilience, adaptation, and human connection that allowed people to continue, to find meaning, and to create lives that, while difficult, were not devoid of value or purpose. As communities developed ways of supporting one another, sharing resources, knowledge, and traditions that helped them navigate the challenges they faced, creating networks of interdependence that, while not eliminating hardship, provided a measure of stability and continuity in cultural practices, whether in the form of storytelling, music, or communal gatherings, offered moments of relief and expression, allowing individuals to connect with something beyond the immediate demands of survival, even if only temporarily. And these aspects of life remind us that human experience is rarely defined by a single dimension, that even in the most difficult circumstances people seek out and create meaning, drawing on their relationships, beliefs, and shared experiences to make sense of the world around them. And this complexity is essential to understanding the Renaissance not simply as a time of contradiction, but as a period in which different layers of human experience coexisted, where hardship and creativity, limitation and aspiration, were all part of the same reality. And when we consider the legacy of this era, it is important to recognize both the extraordinary achievements that have been celebrated and the everyday lives that have often been overlooked, because the story of the Renaissance is not only about the art, the discoveries, or the ideas that emerged, but also about the millions of people who lived through it, whose experiences were shaped by conditions that were often harsh and unforgiving, and whose contributions, while less visible, were no less essential to the functioning of the societies in which they lived. And in reflecting on this, we are reminded that history's so-called golden ages are rarely uniform in their impact, that progress can exist alongside inequality, that advancement in one area does not automatically lead to improvement in all areas, and that the experiences of individuals within any given period can vary widely depending on their position within the social and economic structures of the time. And this understanding challenges us to look beyond simplified narratives and to engage with the past in a way that acknowledges its complexity, recognizing that the beauty, brilliance we often associate with the Renaissance were part of a larger and more nuanced reality, one that included struggle, endurance, and the ongoing effort of ordinary people to navigate a world that offered both opportunities and obstacles. And in doing so, we gain a deeper and more balanced perspective on this period, one that does not diminish its achievements but places them within the context of the lives that surrounded them, allowing us to appreciate not only what was created but also what was endured, and to understand that for many, the Renaissance was not experienced as a time of rebirth or transformation, but as a continuation of the challenges that had always defined human existence, shaped by forces that were often beyond individual control and navigated through a combination of resilience, community, and the enduring human capacity to adapt to even the most difficult circumstances. And in this way, the true story of the Renaissance becomes not just a tale of greatness, but a reflection of the full spectrum of human experience, where the light of achievement and the shadow of hardship existed together, each giving meaning to the other, and each playing a role in shaping the world that would follow. And when we step back and look at the Renaissance as a whole, beyond the illusions, beyond the paintings and the polished stories of genius and rebirth, we begin to see something far more complex and far more human, a period that was not defined by a single experience, but by a deep contrast between what was celebrated and what was lived, between what was remembered and what was endured. And it is in this contrast that the true meaning of the era begins to emerge, because history has a way of highlighting the extraordinary while quietly setting aside the ordinary, even though it is the ordinary that makes up the vast majority of human experience. And so when we talk about the Renaissance as a time that changed the world, we are not wrong, but we are only telling part of the story, because change does not happen in a vacuum, and it does not affect everyone equally. It moves through societies unevenly, touching some lives in profound ways while barely reaching others. And for most people living during this time, the great transformations that we now associate with the Renaissance were distant, abstract, and often irrelevant to the immediate challenges they faced every day, challenges that required constant attention and effort just to survive, leaving little space for the kind of reflection or engagement that might connect them to the broader cultural shifts taking place around them. And this disconnect between historical significance and lived experience is one of the most important things to understand when we try to see the Renaissance clearly, because it reminds us that what we choose to remember is not always what mattered most to those who lived through it, and it challenges us to reconsider the way we define progress, not as something that can be measured solely by achievements or innovations, but as something that must also be evaluated in terms of how it impacts the lives of ordinary people, how it changes their conditions, their opportunities, their sense of possibility. And in many ways the Renaissance reveals how progress can exist alongside persistent hardship, how societies can advance intellectually and culturally while still maintaining systems that limit freedom, reinforce inequality, and constrain the potential of the majority. And this is not unique to that period, but is a pattern that appears throughout history, where moments of great achievement are often built on foundations that include struggle, sacrifice, and imbalance. And recognizing this pattern does not diminish the accomplishments of the Renaissance, but rather places them within a more honest and complete context, allowing us to appreciate both the brilliance of what was created and the reality of the world in which it was created, a world that was far from ideal and often deeply challenging for those who lived in it. And as we reflect on this, it becomes clear that the idea of a golden age is often more about perspective than reality, shaped by what we choose to focus on and what we choose to overlook, because every period of history contains both light and shadow, both moments of progress and experiences of hardship, and the Renaissance is no exception. It is a time that produced extraordinary works of art and thought, while also being a time in which many people lived difficult, constrained, and uncertain lives. And this duality is essential to understanding not only the past but also the present, because it reminds us that progress is rarely simple or uniform, that it often comes with contradictions and complexities that cannot be ignored if we want to truly understand it. And it also encourages us to think more critically about the narratives we inherit, to question the stories that present history in simplified or idealized terms, and to look more closely at the experiences of those who are not always represented in those stories, because it is through these experiences that we gain a deeper and more nuanced understanding of what it means to live through a particular time. And when we apply this perspective to the Renaissance, we begin to see it not as a flawless period of rebirth, but as a dynamic and multifaceted era in which human potential and human limitation existed side by side, shaping each other in ways that are both inspiring and sobering. And this understanding allows us to move beyond admiration into reflection, to consider not only what was achieved, but also what was endured, and to recognize that the legacy of the Renaissance is not just found in its masterpieces or its ideas, but also in the lives of the countless individuals who navigated its challenges, who contributed in ways that may not have been recorded or celebrated, but were nonetheless essential to the functioning of their societies. And in acknowledging this, we give a voice to the silent majority of the past, those whose stories are often overlooked but whose experiences are no less important. And we also gain insight into the broader human condition, into the ways in which people adapt to their circumstances, find meaning in difficult situations, and continue to move forward even when faced with significant obstacles. And this insight is valuable not only for understanding history, but for understanding ourselves, because it highlights the resilience that is inherent in human life, the capacity to endure and to create even in less than ideal conditions. And at the same time it serves as a reminder of the importance of striving for a more equitable distribution of progress, of ensuring that advancements in knowledge, culture, and technology are not limited to a select few, but are shared in ways that improve the lives of many. And this is perhaps one of the most important lessons we can take from looking at the Renaissance in this way, that while it stands as a testament to what humanity can achieve, it also reveals the gaps that can exist between achievement and experience, between potential and reality. It challenges us to think about how those gaps can be addressed, both in our interpretation of the past and in our approach to the future, because the story of the Renaissance is not just a story about what happened centuries ago. It is a reflection of patterns that continue to shape the world today, patterns of inequality, of uneven progress, of the tension between innovation and accessibility. And by understanding these patterns in the context of history, we are better equipped to recognize them in our own time and to consider how they might be changed. And so as we conclude this exploration of what life was really like during the Renaissance, it is worth holding on to both sides of the story, the beauty and the struggle, the achievements and the realities, because it is only by acknowledging both that we can fully appreciate the complexity of the era and the people who lived through it. And in doing so we move closer to a more complete and honest understanding of history, one that does not rely on idealization or simplification but embraces the full range of human experience, recognizing that even in times of great change and creativity, life for most people can remain difficult, uncertain, and shaped by forces beyond their control, and that this truth, while perhaps less inspiring than the image of a golden age, is ultimately more meaningful because it connects us more directly to the realities of the past and to the enduring nature of the human experience across time. And when you bring all of this together, when you strip away the romanticized images, the polished narratives, and the selective memory that history often presents, what you are left with is something far more grounded and far more real, a version of the Renaissance that is not built on illusion but on the lived experiences of millions of ordinary people, people whose lives were shaped not by opportunity and inspiration but by necessity, limitation, and endurance. And it is here, in this more honest view, that the true weight of the era can be felt, because it forces us to confront a simple but powerful truth, that what we often celebrate as progress does not automatically translate into a better life for everyone, that the rise of art, knowledge, and innovation does not erase inequality or eliminate suffering, and that behind every period we admire, there are stories that are rarely told, stories of struggle, sacrifice, and survival that exist alongside the achievements we remember. And this realization changes the way we look at the Renaissance, transforming it from a distant, almost mythical golden age into something more human, more complex, and more relatable, because instead of seeing it as a time when everything improved, we begin to understand it as a time when some things improved for some people while many others continued to face the same challenges that had always defined their lives. And in this sense, the Renaissance becomes not just a story about what humanity can achieve, but also a reminder of how uneven those achievements can be in their impact, how progress can coexist with hardship, and how the benefits of change are often distributed in ways that reflect existing structures of power rather than challenging them. And this perspective invites us to think more critically about the way we interpret history, to question the narratives that present certain periods as universally positive, and to look more closely at whose voices are being included, whose are being left out, because the story of any era is not complete unless it accounts for the full range of experiences within it, not just those that are easy to celebrate or admire. And when we apply this approach to the Renaissance, we begin to see that its legacy is not only found in the masterpieces that hang in museums or the ideas that shaped modern thought, but also in the everyday lives of the people who lived through it, people who worked, struggled, adapted, and endured in conditions that were often difficult and unforgiving, and whose contributions, while less visible, were essential to the functioning of the societies that made those achievements possible. And in recognizing this, we gain a deeper appreciation for the complexity of the past, for the way in which different layers of experience interact and influence one another, and for the importance of looking beyond surface-level interpretations to understand the full picture. And this deeper understanding also has implications for how we think about the present, because it highlights patterns that continue to exist, reminding us that progress is rarely evenly distributed, that advancements in one area do not automatically lead to improvements in all areas, and that the benefits of change often depend on factors such as access, resources, and social position. And by recognizing these patterns in the context of history, we become more aware of them in our own time, more capable of questioning them, and more prepared to think about how they might be addressed. And this is where the study of the Renaissance, and history more broadly, becomes not just an exercise in learning about the past, but a tool for understanding the present and shaping the future, because it provides us with examples of how societies have evolved, how they have succeeded and failed, and how the choices made within them have affected different groups of people in different ways. And it encourages us to think about what kind of progress we value, what kind of changes we want to see, and how those changes can be made in a way that benefits not just a select few, but a broader population. And in this way, the Renaissance serves as both an inspiration and a caution, a reminder of what humanity is capable of achieving, and a warning about the limitations of that achievement when it is not accompanied by a more inclusive and equitable distribution of its benefits. And as we reflect on this, it becomes clear that the true significance of the Renaissance lies not only in its contributions to art and knowledge, but also in the questions it raises about society, progress, and human experience, questions that remain relevant today, and that continue to challenge us to think more deeply about the world we live in. And so when we look back at this period, it is important to hold on to both sides of its legacy, to appreciate the beauty and brilliance that emerged from it, while also acknowledging the realities that define the lives of most people, because it is only by doing so that we can fully understand what the Renaissance was and what it means, not as a perfect golden age, but as a complex and multifaceted chapter in human history, one that reflects both the heights of human creativity and the enduring challenges of human existence. And in embracing this complexity, we move closer to a more honest and meaningful engagement with the past, one that recognizes that history is not made up solely of great achievements but also of everyday lives, of struggles and perseverance, of moments of hardship and moments of resilience, all of which together create the full story of what it means to be human across time. And in this understanding there is a kind of clarity, a recognition that while the past may be different from the present in many ways, the fundamental aspects of human experience, the desire to survive, to find meaning, to create, and to endure, remain constant, connecting us to those who lived centuries ago and reminding us that their world, however distant it may seem, was shaped by forces and experiences that are not entirely unfamiliar, and that by studying it with honesty and depth, we can gain insights that extend beyond history itself, informing the way we see ourselves, our societies, and the paths we choose moving forward. Even as we reflect on the Renaissance, it is clear that the era cannot be reduced to a simple story of glory, brilliance, and innovation. It was a period of contradictions, a time when incredible human achievement unfolded side by side with the harsh realities of daily life, and this duality is what makes understanding it so important. While we admire the magnificent works of art, the advances in science, and the new ways of thinking that emerged, we must also recognize that these accomplishments were the experiences of a relatively small segment of the population, people who had access to wealth, education, and influence. For the vast majority, life was defined by labor, scarcity, disease, and rigid social hierarchies that offered very little mobility or freedom. This awareness challenges the romanticized notion of the Renaissance as a purely golden age. The world that ordinary people inhabited was far from golden. Fields were subject to the whims of weather, harvests could fail without warning, and hunger was a constant presence. Homes were often cramped, damp, and unsanitary, with multiple generations living in a single room alongside animals. Streets in towns and cities were often filled with waste and filth, and clean water was scarce. Disease could strike at any moment, and medical knowledge was limited, making even minor injuries potentially fatal. Life was fragile, and survival required constant effort, endurance, and resilience. The social structures of the Renaissance reinforced these inequalities. Power and privilege were concentrated in the hands of nobles, rulers, and the church, while peasants, laborers, and servants had little control over their own destinies. Gender roles further constrained women, limiting their autonomy and confining them to domestic responsibilities, while men without wealth or status were bound by labor and obligation. The societal hierarchy created a stark contrast between those who could participate in the intellectual and cultural flourishing of the era and those who lived entirely within the narrow confines of survival. Yet within these harsh realities there was still humanity, resilience, and adaptation. Communities supported one another, shared knowledge, and built networks of care and interdependence. Families and neighborhoods developed ways to endure famine, disease, and social pressure. Cultural practices, music, storytelling, religious rituals, and festivals provided moments of joy, connection, and relief, reminding people that even in the hardest circumstances, life could be lived with purpose and meaning. Children grew up learning skills that allowed them to contribute to their families and communities, often taking on adult responsibilities from a young age, and through these shared efforts, society persisted despite the formidable challenges. By examining the Renaissance in this way, we gain a more honest and nuanced understanding of history. We see that progress is not uniform and that achievements in one area of society often coexist with hardship and limitation in another. The Renaissance, in all its brilliance, was not experienced equally by all. It was a time of profound innovation for some and relentless struggle for many. Recognizing this complexity helps us appreciate both the extraordinary contributions of the era and the everyday lives of those who endured its challenges, giving voice to the silent majority whose stories are often overlooked. Moreover, the lessons of the Renaissance extend beyond history. They encourage us to critically evaluate our own times, to ask who benefits from progress and who may be left behind, and to consider how achievements in culture, technology, and knowledge can be paired with equity and opportunity for all. They remind us that human resilience and creativity thrive even in the most difficult circumstances, but they also call on us to create systems that reduce unnecessary suffering and expand access to the benefits of advancement. By learning from the past, we can not only honor the complexity of history, but also take inspiration to make the present and future more inclusive and compassionate. In conclusion, the Renaissance was a period of contradictions, brilliance, and struggle, a world in which extraordinary achievements existed alongside the realities of daily survival. It was a time when human creativity reached new heights, yet most people lived with labor, hunger, disease, and rigid social hierarchies. Understanding the Renaissance fully requires looking beyond the masterpieces and intellectual advancements to the lived experiences of the millions who worked tirelessly, endured hardship, and adapted to circumstances far beyond their control. It is in this duality that the true story emerges, a story that reminds us that history is not only made up of the celebrated, but also of the ordinary, not only of the triumphs, but also of the resilience, endurance, and humanity of those whose lives were not recorded in grand paintings or preserved in books, yet whose existence formed the foundation upon which society and culture were built. By recognizing this, we gain a deeper, more meaningful understanding of the past, appreciating not only what was created but also what was endured, and we can apply these insights to our own lives and societies today. We learn that progress is never evenly distributed, that survival often requires resilience and adaptation, and that true understanding comes from acknowledging both the light and the shadow in history. The Renaissance, therefore, is not just a story of brilliance, but also a story of humanity, of what people endured, how they survived, and how they contributed to the world around them, even when their efforts went largely unseen. And in appreciating this fuller picture, we honor not only the achievements of the era, but also the extraordinary endurance and spirit of the countless individuals whose lives shaped it. So, if you found this deep dive into the realities of the Renaissance eye-opening and thought-provoking, don't forget to hit the like button, share this video with friends who love history, and subscribe to the channel for more in-depth explorations of the past. Make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss a story that uncovers the human experiences behind the events we read about in textbooks. Your support helps us keep bringing history to life, one story at a time.